This is Michael from O'Connell Landscape, and today we're talking about bark, or sometimes we might say wood chips or wood mulch, things that we use to dress up our landscapes and cover the ground. We're going to talk a little bit about what barks we should choose, what we use them for, things some barks are better at than other barks. So let's kind of jump right into it. Right here I have laid out 11 different barks from our friends at Snow Marin Materials. And so we're going to go through and talk about pros and cons and give kind of an in-detail overview of these different choices. And to help me do this, I've got my friend David the Gnome here, and he's going to give us, with our Fat Max tape measure, a little bit of scale. So as we're talking about each one of these, we'll bring in David, and that'll allow you to get a little idea of what the scale is of each of these barks we're talking about. I divided these bark into 3 different main categories. I've got bark that's dyed chips, where it's actually had a dye applied to the chip. I've got yellow chips, which are sort of a base yellow color. And then I've got red-brown chips that are a little bit darker in color. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit more. So let's jump right into it. So the first one I have here are dyed chips. And you can see here this shadow chip. Within each of these different barks, I've divided them into 3 categories. So we have low cost, medium cost, and high cost. And remember, this bark comparison is for Northern California, and that's based on the nomenclature at Snow Marin Materials. But every yard calls bark different things. Some people call, one bark tan bark. Some call them fir chip. Some call them walk-on. There's lots of different names for possibly the same material. And there's different blends depending on the supplier. So what one yard has, another yard might have something completely different. But this is a pretty representative sample of what we're going to find in our area in Marin-Sonoma County. So let's jump right in here. The first one I have is Shadow. And Shadow is a dyed bark, and it is jet black. And how they do that is they take a bark similar to this playground fiber over here, and they put a dark dye on that. And people really like the looks of shadow bark because it is nice and small. And let's bring in David here and we'll get a feel for what the size is here. But the shadow is nice and small. It's material size. And it has a real unique kind of modern look. But the challenge on the shadow that I don't like is over time that dye starts to wear off. And it also shows a lot of leaf litter and debris. So this beautiful uniform black bark that we roll out over time doesn't look so uniform. But it definitely has its place, and I have a lot of clients who really like the shadow bark. Now below shadow is its cousin mahogany bark, and that is taking something like this blonde chip next door, and that's dyeing it with a red-brown color to give it that tone. You'll see this type of bark used a lot on commercial sites. I do have clients who like it. Again, for me personally, I don't like the dyed barks quite as well. This one is a little bit more coarse than our other bark. As we look at the shadow, is a little bit finer there and a little bit coarser material on the mahogany. Both of those I would consider medium cost bark, so not the most expensive, but not the cheapest either. Now next door to these, we've got 3 yellow barks, and we'll start here with the coarsest first, which is Golden Nugget. And you can see this material here is real big and coarse, so we're looking at kind of 1 to 2 inch pieces of bark. Come here, David. 1 to 2 inch pieces of bark there on that Golden Nugget. And the benefit of a larger bark is it takes more time for that to break down, whereas something that's finer is going to break down into the soil a little bit faster. And so you're going to have to reapply a fine bark more frequently than you would have to apply a coarse bark. The other thing to take into consideration is blowers and maintenance. And coarse barks stay put better than finer barks, which tend to wash around more, and they tend to get blown around by leaf blowers more. So that's our Golden Nugget. Coming up from Golden Nugget, we've got Blond Chip. Blond Chip is a little bit more expensive. It's a medium cost bark. Golden Nugget is a little bit lower cost. And we can see this is basically sort of the middle brother of Golden Nugget, a little bit finer. So those chips are in the sort of 3/4 inch size. They're a little bit skinnier. So that's going to be the main difference. But if we're looking for a bark that's got a lighter tone, these yellow toned barks work real well for that. And then the finest of these is playground fiber. And playground fiber is especially bark, and this has been ground up to reduce the amount of splinters. So it's great for playgrounds. That's where we use it, under play structures, that type of thing. Usually a nice thick layer of 6 to 9 inches of bark, depending on what we're using there. Even more, could be up to a foot if we've got a big drop. But that's the main use for playground fiber. And those are our 3 yellow barks that we have at Snow Marin. Now let's go next door and we start to get into a little bit more reddish brown barks and that type of thing. And the first one we're looking at here is a pair of economy barks called blended mulch. And blended mulch has more shreds and chips and kind of stringy pieces, and it has a lot of recycled material in it. And so you're seeing that reflected in how this bark looks. Blended mulch is great in that it's a great economy bark. So if we've got an area that we want to cover, let's say aesthetics are not the prime importance, but we want to cover a big area with wood chips to cut down on weeds, to cover drip irrigation lines, those type of things, blended mulch is going to be a good choice there. Got a little bit more kind of grays in it to kind of mute out some of those yellow tones. Now our other economy bark next door, that's an arbor mulch. And arbor mulch has got a little bit more reds in it. It's a little bit more true yellow. It looks a little bit more composed. It's more expensive. Blended mulch is the cheapest bark that I have out here. But it's a good economy bark that will give you something attractive, but won't break the bank there. So that's our 2 economy options there. And then next off, we're going to jump into our sort of reddish brown barks. And let's start with single grind redwood. Now, single grind redwood, otherwise called gorilla hair or angel hair, it was real popular for a long time before we started to get some of these other bark options out there. You'd see a lot of landscapes. I know, 20, 30 years ago, we used a ton of single grind redwood. One of the reasons we don't use it quite so much anymore is fire hazard. And in areas such as those in the wildland urban interface, this isn't a great choice because you can imagine an ember landing on that real fine single grind, and that's bad news. So we use that less for that. Single grind is great for holding slopes, and that traditionally is what it's been most used for. But also a little bit less expensive, so that's more in the economy low cost category there. Next up we have walk on. And walk on is a medium cost bark, and it's probably the bark from Snow Marin that we install the most because it's kind of a jack of all trades. It's got a blend of materials, so it's got a few little yellow chips in it. It's got some fur that's blended in it. It's got some little stringy pieces blended in it, and it works well in a variety of situations. It's medium cost, so it doesn't break the bank. It's attractive, so that's one of our go-to sort of general purpose barks that we use a ton. And then our last 2 are 2 of the most expensive barks. And these are the cousins, small fir and mini fir. There also is either medium or large fir, which is just real big chunks of fir bark. And we don't use that super frequently, so I don't have that out here. But small fir is another real popular one. It is more expensive, but it gives a real nice finished look, and the tone is more true red-brown. Again, people call that tan bark frequently. And then the last one I have here is mini fir. And mini fir, people like that real fine texture. But one of the challenges of mini fir is it breaks down quickly. It gets blown around by leaf blowers, and it gets washed around by the rain. So for those reasons, I use mini fir less. If I've got planters that are contained or areas that aren't huge, mini fir can be a good choice. But usually I'm going to go small fir most of the time if we're looking at a comparison between the 2 firs. So why do we use bark? What is the advantage of using mulch in the landscape? There's a few main advantages. And first off, bark helps trap moisture. So what we irrigate, we help trap in that moisture by having a nice thick layer of bark. The second thing the bark does is that as it weathers and breaks down, it helps feed the soil. Specifically, we're getting some additional nitrogen in the soil over the long term. And it also helps with our soil structure. So it helps to cultivate good soil structure as that breaks down. So those are both benefits to mulch. The next advantage to mulch is it reduces weed growth. So if you take an area of bare ground and you take an area that's been mulched with a nice 3-inch layer of mulch, you're going to see a significant decrease in the amount of weeds And also weeds that grow in a bark layer are going to be much easier to pull. So it's not that you're not going to have any weeds, but your weeds are going to be much easier to pull. The next thing bark does for us is it helps hide our drip irrigation tubing. So when we run drip irrigation to all of our new plants, it's kind of this big snaked maze of tubing that we're connecting all those plants to. And so the bark helps to protect that tubing from the sun and also puts it out of sight. And then the last reason that we install bark is it looks good. So it creates a nice, consistent look for our planting beds and, kind of makes our landscapes look finished. So those are the advantages to mulch, and I hope this has been a help in terms of helping you look at some different local types of bark and also how we go about selecting those. Thanks.